The first time Felix Enner set foot on the Xenthari Research and Cultural Exchange Station, he was still sore from leg day. The shuttle cabin hissed depressurization as it docked against the station's outer ring. Felix stood, backpack slung over one shoulder, and immediately regretted it. His thighs screamed. Not screamed like a paper cut or a stubbed toe. Screamed like a slow-burning fire that had been quietly building for 36 hours and now decided to throw a fit every time he moved. He winced, gripping the handrail as he stepped toward the exit. His calves weren't much better, tight as cables, every step a negotiation between stubbornness and biology. Behind him, one of the Xenthari attendants tilted its narrow, translucent head. "Are you injured?" it asked, its voice translated through the station's autolingual system with a smooth, almost too polite tone. Felix shook his head. "Nah, just sore from working out." The attendant paused. "From, what kind of injury is working out?" Felix blinked. "It's not an injury. I was lifting weights. Resistance training." The Xenthari didn't respond. It simply stepped aside, apparently logging the information for later horror. Felix stepped off the shuttle and into the main arrivals corridor, part of Sector C. It was clean, metallic, and humming with energy from plasma conduits embedded in the walls. He'd read up on the Xenthari before arrival, bipedal, silicon-based life forms with a communal learning complex that valued precision, health, and what they called biological integrity. They didn't like injuries, they didn't like pain, and they definitely didn't understand voluntary muscle damage, which made it awkward that Felix had been assigned as the temporary physiology instructor for their interspecies youth cohort. He limped into the orientation room, where a dozen Xenthari students waited in orderly rows. Their bodies were semi-translucent, revealing shifting internal structures that glowed faintly depending on their emotional state or cognitive stimulation. They looked like a cross between jellyfish and exosuits, but upright, with limbs that were more functional than elegant. One of them raised a limb as Felix approached. "Human," it said. "Are you in distress?" Felix dropped his bag beside the podium and sat on the edge of the platform. "Not distress, just DOMS." The same student tilted its head. "Explain the acronym." "Delayed onset muscle soreness. It's what happens when you do eccentric contraction exercises like lowering a weight slowly, and your muscle fibers get tiny micro tears. The repair process makes you sore for 1 to 3 days, sometimes more." Another student, more green-toned than the rest, interjected. "You are saying you damage your muscles intentionally?" Felix nodded. "Yeah, it's how human muscles adapt. You stress them just enough to cause tiny tears, then your body repairs those fibers stronger than before. It's how we build strength." There was a long silence, the kind of silence you could pour into a tank and swim in. "Wouldn't this qualify as autotrauma?" the green-toned one asked. Felix chuckled, then winced. His abs were sore, too. "Not exactly. It's controlled stress." "There's a difference between injury and adaptation. But yeah, it hurts." A third student, smaller than the others, stood and walked straight up to Felix. "I must report this to MedCorps," it said. "You are not compatible with our standards of biomechanical ethics." "Oh, hold on," Felix said, raising both hands. "This is normal for humans. I'm not dying. I'm not even injured." "But you said there are ruptures in your muscle tissue," the student insisted. "Micro-ruptures." Felix rubbed his thigh. "They heal. I'll be fine in 2 days." The student turned and left the room immediately. Felix sighed. Great start. Minutes later, a tall Xenthari in a white and blue robe entered the room, flanked by 2 more attendants. Its coloration pulsed deep blue, with streaks of concern. "I am Coordinator HFY. You are Felix Enner?" Felix stood slowly, trying not to show the stiffness in his legs. "Yes, sir." "You are experiencing internal tissue rupture?" "Tense, just muscle soreness from exercise, nothing dangerous." The shul gestured toward the exit. "Come with us. You will submit to a diagnostic scan." Felix debated protesting, but he was a guest on their station. He followed. The medical wing of the station was pristine. filled with soft lighting and strange, humming machines. He stood in a cylindrical scanner while the machine swept his body with a low-frequency resonance field. It tingled, especially around his quads and glutes. After 5 minutes, the results appeared on a central display. Labeled in a combination of Xenthari glyphs and English, the screen highlighted areas of muscular inflammation, increased lactic acid concentration, and microfibril disruption, classic signs of delayed-onset muscle soreness. The attending medic, a Xenthari with a pale silver hue, stared at the screen. "These are consistent with grade 2 fiber separation," it said. "In our kind, this would result in immobilization and long-term therapy." Felix crossed his arms. "For us, it's just part of the process." Process of what? Self-destruction? Improvement? The medic turned to HFY. "He is not in immediate danger, but his physiology is inherently unstable." Felix raised his eyebrows. "I'm not unstable. I'm adaptive." HFY didn't respond right away. He walked a slow circle around Felix, then tapped his interface band. "Return to your quarters," he said. "We must reevaluate your clearance for physical instruction." Felix tried explaining, again, but the coordinator had already turned away. That night, Felix sat in his quarters, eating something that resembled mashed lentils and grilled tofu. He massaged his thighs while reviewing the next day's lesson plan. The soreness was worse now, which tracked with human physiology. DOMS usually peaked around 48 hours post-exercise. There was a knock, well, more like a chime, and the door slid open. The green-toned student entered. "I have studied the phenomenon," it said. Felix looked up. "DOMS?" "Yes. I accessed archival footage from human athletic training centers. I also retrieved your biological data from the scan." "That's a little invasive, but okay. I have a hypothesis. Would you allow me to observe your next exercise session?" Felix hesitated. "So you can report me again?" "No. I wish to understand." The next morning they met in the station's biomechanical lab. Felix set up a resistance band circuit and began with light warm-ups. The student, who introduced itself as Vesh, watched silently, occasionally taking notes. Felix moved through squats, lunges, and rows. His muscles protested, but he kept his form tight. He dialed back the intensity to avoid further soreness, but even so, his range of motion was limited. Vesh watched every movement. "You are reactivating damaged fibers," it said during Felix's third set of push-ups. "Right. Controlled stress triggers protein synthesis. The soreness is from inflammation, not structural failure." Vesh considered this. "You voluntarily enter a compromised state, then push that system again before full recovery." "Sometimes. Depends on the training cycle. There's a balance." After an hour, Felix sat down, breathing hard. Vesh approached with a small scanner. "May I?" Felix nodded. The scan confirmed increased blood flow, localized swelling, and elevated surface heat on Felix's thighs and shoulders. Vesh stared at the data. "You are regenerating." Felix chuckled. "Not like a lizard, just repairing tissue. The body adapts if you give it the right nutrition and recovery." Vesh blinked several times, then turned and left again without saying a word. Later that week, Felix returned to the classroom. This time, there were no questions about his injuries. Instead, Vesh presented a report. Human muscle fibers undergo hypertrophy through regulated microtrauma. The inflammatory response is not pathological, but adaptive. This process increases tensile strength and metabolic efficiency. Felix raised an eyebrow. "That's an accurate summary?" The other students nodded, some of them already pulling up simulated models of human musculature. HFY entered mid-lecture and observed silently. At the end, he approached Felix. "You have caused discomfort among my students. However, I see now that discomfort is not always damage." Felix smiled. "Exactly. You are cleared to continue instruction, within reason." Felix bowed slightly. Appreciate it. As the students filed out, Vesh lingered a moment longer. Your methods are reckless, it said quietly, but effective. Felix nodded. That's humanity for you. We break a little. Then we build back stronger. 2 days later, Felix walked into the biomechanical lab with a duffel slung over his shoulder and a slight limp in his left stride. The limp wasn't from injury, more of a lingering stiffness that hadn't quite worked itself out. The Xenthari didn't comment on it this time. They'd been watching him train for nearly an hour every cycle since the first lesson, and at least 6 of the students had started bringing their own data slates to track his vitals. Vesh was already waiting inside, standing near a diagnostic station with a row of biofeedback monitors, blinking in shades of violet. The room smelled faintly of ozone and sterilizing agents, and soft pulses of kinetic energy buzzed from the floor to help stimulate circulation in long-duration lab work. Only the Xenthari would think to upgrade their flooring for vascular microstimulation. You said today would include neural loading, Vesh said without preamble. Yeah, Felix replied, dropping the duffel onto a bench. Blood flow restriction and neuromuscular priming. We'll start with isometrics, then contrast loading. You brought the stim units? Vesh held up a tray with 2 compact devices that looked like oversized silver beetles with sensor pads for legs. These are calibrated to your nerve conduction thresholds, it said. I also adjusted the waveform to match your spinal reflex latency. Felix tested one of the devices against his forearm and gave a short nod. Looks good. Let's get started. He stripped down to shorts and a compression vest, attaching the stim units to his quads and deltoids. As soon as Vesh activated the first sequence, his muscles twitched in rhythmic pulses-controlled contractions, just strong enough to recruit fast-twitch fibers without overexertion. Feels like someone's flicking my nerves with a rubber band, he said. This is not medically advisable, Vesh replied, eyes narrowing in what might have been concern. Your nervous system tolerates this? Up to a point. We're not frying anything. This just wakes up pathways that aren't firing efficiently, gets the central nervous system online before heavy movement, cuts down on warm-up time. Your system prioritizes time over biological stability. Felix chuckled. We call it efficiency. He moved into a set of isometric holds wall sits at 90 degrees, arms extended forward, back flat against the smooth surface of the lab wall. The stim units buzzed again, and his thighs started to shake under the combined tension. Don't interrupt me during the next 30 seconds, he said through gritted teeth. I'm trying not to black out. Vesh watched the muscle fibers ripple and contract beneath the skin. The data feed showed elevated motor unit recruitment, increased synaptic firing, and a modest rise in internal temperature. After the hold, Felix stood and walked a slow circle around the mat, shaking out his legs. You're going to log this under controlled voluntary stress, right? He asked. I already created a new category, intentional neuromuscular provocation. It has no precedent in Xenthari training philosophy. Sounds fancy. Ready for the next part? Vesh nodded, and Felix moved into weighted box jumps, alternating with slow-motion step-downs to absorb force on the eccentric. He used a vest loaded with magnetized discs that clung to his torso with a soft hum. Each jump drew a faint thud from the mat as he landed, knees tracking over feet, posture sharp and deliberate. After the 3rd round, he paused to catch his breath, leaning over with hands on knees. Heart rate's up. That's good. Means the nervous system's integrating with the metabolic systems, helps reinforce movement patterns under fatigue. Vesh pointed at the readout. Your core temperature increased 0.8 degrees. Your hydration levels are suboptimal. I'll drink when I'm done. That is contrary to performance maintenance protocols. Not if you're used to training dry. Teaches your body to manage fluid distribution better. Vesh looked at him like he'd just confessed to eating radioactive glass. You are actively dehydrating to simulate stress? Not always, just sometimes. It's controlled. Also, I ate a lot of salt this morning. He grabbed a squeeze bottle from his bag and took a measured sip. Vesh tilted its translucent head. I observed your sodium intake earlier. It exceeded normal dietary recommendations. Felix grinned. That's on purpose. Sodium helps retain water, plus it keeps blood volume high. You are manipulating homeostatic systems manually. Exactly. That's why it works. Besh turned to the monitor again. You are modifying endocrine responses through behavioral inputs. This seems inefficient. It's adaptable. Our systems aren't as stable as yours, so we learn to control the variables we can. Another student, pale with a ripple of green across its thorax, drifted into the lab and paused when it saw Felix dragging a sled loaded with resistance bands. Is he preparing for emergency evacuation? Besh answered without looking up. No. He is conditioning his posterior chain to improve power transfer during ground contact. The newcomer stepped closer. He appears to be punishing himself. Felix pulled the sled halfway across the room and waved. Hey, you're welcome to try it. The student recoiled half a step. I would prefer not to compromise my locomotion systems. Fair, Felix said, turning back to the sled, but you're missing out. After the session, Felix lay on the mat, with his legs elevated against the wall. His breathing had slowed, and the stim units were cooling down. Vesh sat nearby, reviewing the session metrics. Your tissue oxygenation dropped below baseline during the final set, yet you did not stop. That's the point. Teaches the body to work under oxygen decade. Improves efficiency at the cellular level. Xenthari would be removed from activity under those parameters. Yeah, but we're built different. Not better, just more chaotic. Besh was quiet for several seconds. Then, you are not afraid of biological instability. We're afraid of a lot of things, Felix said, staring at the ceiling. But we don't like being told what limits us. 3 hours later, after a nutrient-dense meal and an ice bath that he rigged using station coolant packs, Felix returned to the lab. Vesh was still there, now accompanied by 2 more students. They were examining a projection of his neuromuscular scans, highlighting areas of increased density and microvascular remodeling. You should not be recovering this quickly, one of them said. There are no augmentation markers. Nope, all natural, just years of adaptation. Vesh turned to him. We have a question. If your systems are so adaptable, why do you not simply achieve stasis? Felix sat on the bench and pulled on his hoodie. Because stasis is boring, we're wired to chase improvement, even when it hurts. The second student, smaller and darker-hued, looked skeptical. You degrade yourself to improve? We push ourselves to find the edge. Sometimes we cross it. Then we learn the illogical. Maybe. But it works. That evening, he received a message from the lab's overseer asking for a demonstration session open to the wider department. Apparently, word had spread. They wanted to observe human adaptive conditioning in real time. The scheduled session was set for 3 days later. Felix leaned back in the chair, legs propped on the desk. He opened the training log and began drafting a template for the demonstration. It would include progressive overload, metabolic conditioning, and recovery strategies, all designed to show how humans could intentionally stress their systems and still bounce back stronger. He already knew what the Xenthari would think: reckless, inefficient, contradictory. But maybe, just maybe, they'd start to understand. Not everything needed to be perfect to be powerful. Felix adjusted the weighted vest on his shoulders as the lab lights dimmed to their standard observation levels. A soft chime echoed through the chamber, signaling the beginning of the scheduled demonstration. The space was now twice as full as usual. At least 30 Xenthari had filed in, their fluidic bodies arranged in a semicircle around the exercise area. Most of them were from the biomechanics and adaptation departments, though a few bore the iridescent bands of philosophical inquiry. Vesh stood beside the control panel, its limbs folded neatly. It had taken over the logistics of the session once word spread that Felix's training wasn't just tolerated, it was becoming a curiosity worth documenting. Are we calibrated on all feeds? Felix asked, rolling his shoulders. We are recording muscle conductivity, oxygen uptake, cardiac rhythm, and neurochemical flux, Vesh replied. I have also added motion analysis overlays, per request from the kinetics pod. Good. Let's give them something they can't model in a spreadsheet. He stepped into the marked zone, a thin platform embedded with pressure sensors and force plates. The warm-up began with controlled joint articulations, ankle dorsiflexions, shoulder rolls, hip openers. A few Xenthari leaned forward slightly, their bodies glowing with interest as the monitors flickered with real-time data. Human static priming begins with low-load movement to wake up neural pathways, Vesh narrated, speaking into the translator node for the benefit of the observers. Unlike our species, their systems require gradual excitation to achieve full-range motor command. Felix transitioned to a sequence of alternating pistol squats, each movement deliberate, the depth measured. He paused at the bottom of each rep, holding for 2 seconds, then rose with controlled breath. The force plates registered his ground reaction forces, and one of the observers let out a clicking vibration. Notice the joint angles, Vesh continued. He achieves full flexion without compensatory collapse, despite prior microtrauma. This demonstrates an integrated adaptive response. Felix glanced up. They can ask questions if they want. A tall Xenthari stepped forward, its lower limbs tapering into segmented digits that bent with insect-like precision. Your anterior cruciate stabilizers are under high tension. How do you prevent rupture? Strength in surrounding tissue, Felix said between movements. Ligaments aren't the primary load bearers. Muscles, tendons, they take most of it if trained properly. You build redundancy. The alien tilted its head. Redundancy in biological systems is considered inefficient. Maybe, but we'd rather have backups than break. He shifted into explosive jump squats, each landing cushioned by bent knees and active foot engagement. The force plates registered the impact, and the screen showed a brief dip in venous return, followed by a spike in cardiac output. Felix's breathing deepened, but his rhythm stayed steady. A younger Xenthari with shimmering lateral ridges pointed toward the monitor. You are voluntarily elevating your heart load. Does this not cause vascular stress? That's the point. Stress it so it adapts. Capillaries expand, heart muscle strengthens, oxygen delivery improves. You don't get better without demanding more. But the risk is calculated. We don't do this blindly. There's a line. And we learn where it is by edging toward it, not avoiding it. Silence followed, broken only by the soft hum of the stim units powering up again. Felix applied them to his calves this time, prepping for sprint intervals on the treadmill. The Xenthari had cleared space and activated the curved high-speed track embedded in the lab floor. He stepped onto it and initiated the sequence. The belt moved slowly at first, then accelerated with smooth precision. Felix ran barefoot, his own choice, each footfall a whisper of contact. The stim pulses timed with his stride cadence, firing his calves just before foot strike to enhance neuromuscular synchronization. The screen showed increased corticospinal activity, along with a bump in dopamine and a mild cortisol surge. You appear to be in a stress state, said one of the observers. Felix nodded mid-stride. Acute stress, short-term, it primes adaptation. Chronic stress is the bad kind. You can distinguish between them internally? Not always consciously, but we learn to read the signs. Elevated resting heart rate? Bad. Poor sleep? Bad. But this is productive. The treadmill hit maximum velocity, and Felix pushed harder, torso leaning slightly forward, arms driving in rhythm. The belt maintained a steady hum, and the pressure sensors tracked every footfall with granular precision. After 60 seconds, he stepped off, chest rising and falling rapidly. He walked a slow circle around the mat, letting his pulse settle. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his calves twitched reflexively from the stim discharge. Vesh approached with a hydration pack. Your electrolyte gradient is dropping. Felix took a sip, then rolled his eyes. Still not going to cramp, I preloaded. Several Xenthari began reviewing their data slates, exchanging brief pulses of bioluminescent commentary. One of them, a wider-bodied scholar from the structural biology division, stepped forward. "This training is not just physical," it said. "You are engaging psychological systems simultaneously." "Correct," Felix said. "Mental resilience is part of it. You train your brain to override discomfort. Pain is information, not an emergency." Another observer tapped its interface. "But you experience damage. The scans are clear." "Not damage, disruption. And disruption's the first step to rebuilding." Vesh looked up from the tablet. "Rebuilding with improved capacity." "Exactly." Felix moved to the final station, the reactive balance module. Two narrow platforms shifted unpredictably underfoot, designed to challenge proprioception and dynamic stability. He stepped onto them, arms relaxed at his sides. The platforms wobbled, tilted, and twisted, but Felix adjusted with micro-corrections, knees bending, hips shifting. The Xenthari watched in silence as the readouts showed spikes in cerebellar activity and vestibular coordination. "No external support," one of them said. "You rely entirely on internal feedback." "That's how we improve balance. You can't grow a system you don't challenge." The module finished its sequence, and Felix stepped off. His shirt clung to him, soaked through. He wiped his face with a towel from his bag and turned toward the semicircle of observers. "That's the session," he said. "Questions?" One of the biomechanists raised a limb. "Your system appears designed to destabilize and reassemble. Is that your species' default behavior?" Felix shrugged. "Pretty much. We fall apart a little, then figure out how to come back stronger." Vesh looked up from the data. "You are not optimized for stasis, you are optimized for volatility." "That's one way to put it." Another scholar added, "This contradicts standard models of biological efficiency. Maybe your models need more chaos." There was a long pause as the group absorbed the full implications. Then the philosophical observer stepped forward. "Would it be accurate to say you thrive through struggle?" Felix considered that. "Depends on the struggle, but yeah. We grow through resistance. That's the point of training. That's the point of being human." There were no more questions. Later that evening, Felix sat alone in the observation deck overlooking the artificial gravity garden. A few Xenthari passed by, nodding, or whatever their equivalent was, in acknowledgement. His muscles ached, but it was the good kind, the kind that whispered, not screamed. Besh joined him, carrying a small display slate. "The data from your demonstration is already under review," it said. "Some departments are considering trialing human-style conditioning protocols, with modifications." Felix looked out at the hydroponic trees, their roots suspended in nutrient mist. "Just don't let them skip the hard parts. They are curious, not foolish." They sat in silence for a while, the station's soft ambient glow reflecting off the glass. Felix leaned back. "You ever think maybe discomfort is the proof we're alive?" Besh didn't answer right away. Eventually it said, "That would explain much about you." Felix closed his eyes briefly, letting the soreness settle in like an old friend. "Yeah," he said, "it usually does."